The styles and imagery of 19th century American landscape painting are entwined with the ideas of westward expansion and American identity. Artists from the Hudson River School painted realistic but aggrandized scenes that they had observed when accompanying surveyors and explorers to new territories. The images created from this exploration were then sold to a newly urban Eastern audience. This is Mount Hood by William Bradford. It was painted in 1882, slightly later in his career. Bradford is actually known for his paintings of the Arctic. However, there was a period where he followed in the footsteps of other Hudson River artists and traveled west. Mount Hood is a peak in western Oregon near Portland. Notice in this painting how he has decided to paint the lone peak lit up with orange light from a sunrise, the trees and river in the foreground still in shadow. The scene is meant to conjure that awe-inspiring moment when the sun hits the mountain just right for it to look as if it were glowing. One thing that's important to understand about landscape painting in the 19th century is how a painting was actually created. This is one of Bradford's sketches, which he made during one of 6 trips to the Arctic and the coast of Labrador in the 1860s. Bradford also traveled with a photographer, but he always sketched and took notes while he was on his expeditions. After the expedition was over, Bradford would take all of those photos and sketches and create his paintings based on the images. He painted successfully for decades based solely on the materials gathered over the course of those 6 trips. Once he was home in his studio, Bradford was free to combine, embellish, and create new landscapes from his sketches. He also could use his notes to create color and light that enhanced the feeling of an image. For audiences at this time, landscape painting was sometimes a way to experience a place that they would never see themselves, like the coast of Labrador, shown here. In order to finance his expeditions, Bradford took along groups of wealthy adventurers. Most had read about or seen images of the Arctic, and for them it was an exciting and foreign land that they could explore. Some of these adventurers were just along for the ride, but some were there to write an account of the expedition, like this book in the library's collection, written by Isaac Hayes in 1872. Notice the illustration included, which was an etching likely made from a photo reference taken on the trip. While Bradford focused on the northeast coast, with a few sojourns west, German-born Albert Beerstat made his career shaping the identity of the American West for East Coast audiences. In early 1859, he accompanied a government survey expedition headed by Frederick W. Lander to the Nebraska Territory. By summer, the party had reached the Wind River range of the Rocky Mountains in present-day Wyoming, seen here. This painting was well received back in New York and could be interpreted as sort of an advertisement for this new frontier. Notice how the sun highlights the mountain peaks and illuminates the native people and their village. Beerstat is well known for his use of dramatic lighting that enhances the majesty of a landscape. As you can see, this painting, owned by the Met, is very similar to the previous one held in the collection of the New Bedford Library. Same mountain range in the background, same river and Native American encampment in the foreground. But there are some notable differences if you look closely. It's more zoomed out and has a different focal point highlighted with Beerstat's signature dramatic lighting, the waterfall instead of the village. Why then do we have 2 large-scale paintings of almost the same scene painted 2 years apart? Beerstat's artistic process was very similar to Bradford's, and his brothers even owned a photography studio and often accompanied him on his trips. Beerstat sketched and photographed the landscape and then painted based on those images once he was back in the studio, which meant that if there was a market for it, he could create more than one painting with the same basic view. Another advantage of completing a painting in the studio was that it allowed him to create larger, more detailed canvases whose scale fit their subject. This is a picture of Beerstat painting with an audience in his studio. You can see he has his reference images propped up on his easel, and his studio is decorated with art made by native people from the areas he was painting. This photo can be assumed to be at least somewhat posed, but it was not unusual for an artist's influential friends and colleagues to stop by to see what he might be working on. And finally, what is almost a culmination of the previous series of paintings, this print is made after Rocky Mountain's Landers Peak. It was produced by the printmaker James Smiley, who would have been hired to translate the painting into a line drawing, which was then etched into a metal plate so that it could be mass-produced. This was a common practice, and it meant that not just the very wealthy were exposed to these paintings, which were by and large held in private collections. In fact, the library has 2 copies of this print and another later version which has been painted with watercolor. Landscape art was very popular in this time period, and the market for it was able to support a range of buyers, from the up-and-coming middle class to the super rich. So what conclusions can we draw from the few images you've seen here, which is a tiny amount compared to the vast range of landscape painting done during the 19th century? All of the images you've seen have been created with intention and purpose to show only the best and most beautiful parts of a landscape and none of the hardships. They emphasize the grandeur of snow-capped mountain ranges and fertile valleys that white settlers came to expect when they moved west, truly the land of milk and honey. Although what they found when they arrived did not necessarily match up with that ideal, and in fact ended with the destruction and dislocation of entire indigenous cultures. It is unlikely that artists had these consequences in mind when they were painting, though. Most were just followers of the prevailing artistic movement at the time, Romanticism, which emphasized emotion as a part of the aesthetic experience, and what better to conjure on the sublime than a mountain peak at sunset.